So thanks everybody for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My plan, as Angie mentioned, is to give you an overview of our research program, and I wanted to sort of do that in two steps. I'll start by talking about what we're doing in the research arm of the national office and sort of how our programs are set up, what motivates them, why and how our processes work. And then I also wanted to give a couple of headlines from sort of recent news in the research ecosystem, largely focusing on drug development. So I'll do that at the end. And then again, as Angie mentioned, plenty of time for questions, and so hope to get those as well at the end. To introduce myself briefly, Director of Research, I'm a neuroscientist by training, then worked in commercialization for a little while before moving to the nonprofit side of things. And I've been with the association for a little more than a year now. And I focus primarily on our external research funding operations, but I will speak to that activity plus a number of the other things that we're doing in the research department as a whole. So that said, I want to figure out how to advance my slides. And there we go, start at the top. And so, of course, you have all heard of our 2030 mission and the idea that we want to make ALS livable while we work to cure it. And to do that, we have these three pillars of our strategic plan. We want to find new treatments and cures. We want to optimize current treatments and care, and we want to prevent or delay the harms that are associated with ALS. To go into a little more detail on that, though, I wanted to bring up these bullet points, which are part of our strategic plan, and talk a little bit on the left about what it means to make ALS livable. And so certainly that means longer lives, and so that means life-extending treatments like AMX0035, which was recently approved as Relyvrio, and getting those treatments approved, and also importantly, making them accessible to all people with ALS. We're interested in improved quality of life as we work towards a cure, and so that could be through things like assistive technology, which we can invest in on the research side, and which we can work with our advocacy colleagues to make sure are covered by programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and we can work with our care services colleagues to make sure that people with ALS are able to access these technologies through their local clinics and through distribution programs as well. Can also mean preventing loved ones from getting ALS, and so their genetic screening is a topic that is really top of mind for a lot of us, because certainly genetically targeted therapies are something that we're focused on in the research department. We think they have a lot of potential moving forward, but certainly you have to identify the individuals that would benefit from those treatments. And we have to, again, work with care services, work with advocacy to make sure that genetic screening is something that's accessible to everyone who wants it, and is something where there are recent efforts in the advocacy department to make sure that results of genetic screening tests will not be used sort of against ALS patients who get them in terms of things like changing healthcare premiums and things like that. And so all of these goals, though they have a strong research component, we really work with advocacy and care services to achieve the fullest benefit from these efforts. And so then moving to the right-hand side of the slide, thinking about what are the actions we take to get to these goals of longer lives, improve quality of life, and prevention as well. And we can do that on the research side by finding new treatments and cures, which can mean more clinical trials, more shots on goal, more opportunities for participation with research, and also more focused research. And this is something that is simple to say, but I think the details matter. We want to focus on research that is directly targeted at bringing new therapies to the clinic, as opposed to basic biology research. But that doesn't mean we're not focusing on basic biology as well. The idea is that we want to do both of these things in parallel. And we believe that the ALS research ecosystem is in the right place to do both of those things. We know enough about the science of ALS to focus on clinical development, to focus on bringing new treatments to the clinic and to people with ALS. And obviously, AMX0035, approved as Relyvrio recently, is an example of that. So that is happening. But at the same time, we do want to ultimately work towards a cure. and Relyvrio and many of the other drugs that are in development are not likely to be cures themselves, or Relyvrio is not a cure in and of itself. And so we do need to focus on basic research as well to make sure that in the long term we can get to our ultimate goal of a cure for ALS. So it really is a two-track process, and I don't want to belittle either of those tracks. I want to mention that both of them are quite important for achieving our dual goals. Also, optimizing current treatments and care. There's certainly a lot of things that we can do in the research arm, not just in the care services arm, but we can certainly invest in improvements in assistive technology. We can try and work towards identifying best practices and spreading best practices for care, including in particular early diagnosis, which is a point of emphasis for us. And we're also interested in preventing or delaying the harms that are associated with ALS. And that can be a variety of efforts within research and other departments, including identifying risk factors that change the risk that a person has for developing ALS. Again, I mentioned early diagnosis already, but that's certainly important for us because that is vital for getting the most value possible from the treatments that we do have, and for maximizing opportunities for people with ALS to be in clinical trials as well. And we're working to discover new preventative treatments. And perhaps at the end, I can talk about a recent funding program that we just launched for the first time around this year that is focused on prevention as well. So that's sort of a summary of what we mean by making ALS livable and the types of efforts that we can take to get towards that goal of making ALS livable while we work to cure it. I already mentioned that we do work across research and care services and advocacy, but I want to emphasize that in this slide because I do think it is important that we don't work in silos, and we do across these three pieces of our mission realize that everything that we're doing affects the other pieces as well. And so to get the most value out of any effort in any one of these arms of the organization, we need to communicate with and collaborate with the other arms as well. In this slide, I guess I'm showing, focusing mostly on research, and wanted to emphasize again, or not again, but wanted to emphasize that the ALS Association is the largest philanthropic ALS funder in the world, with over 200 million committed to research, including over 120 million since the Ice Bucket Challenge. And we do fund around the world. It's true that the majority of our funding goes to organizations in the US, but we're funding, I think, 12 or 13 countries, or work in 12 or 13 other countries as well. And that's an effort that we continue because we do believe that we really just want to find the best research wherever it is in the world and fund it and get it to move forward as quickly as possible. And another piece of that is that we do fund and collaborate with not just academic labs, though they are probably the largest single recipient of our grant funding, but also with industry labs, whether that's pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies. And then also we work with government institutions and other nonprofit organizations, often in what we call pre-competitive consortia. And so it's bringing together a lot of these organizations that are working towards goals we share, and maybe it's advancing a biomarker that will make it easier to run clinical trials, or make it easier to diagnose people with ALS earlier and faster. Maybe it's a technology-focused initiative. Maybe it's something that's focused on a piece of science, like perhaps neuroinflammation, which is a process, a biological process that's common to ALS and a number of other neurodegenerative disorders. So we could collaborate with a lot of different groups and really leverage the expertise that is out there in other pieces of the research community and bring all that to bear on research for ALS. And then next, I wanted to go over a couple of things we do specifically with care services and advocacy. With care services, we work on our CTCE certification, and CTCE is Clinical Treatment Centers of Excellence. I always get the acronym a little bit wrong. And that's our certification for clinics that sort of meet our standards for multidisciplinary care and also conduct clinical research. And so we work with those clinics on that certification process. We have a quality improvement program that we're just starting to roll out, where we are trying to help different clinics and identify best practices for multidisciplinary care, and then ultimately spread those practices across the other clinics that we're associated with. Again, recently we released our trial capacity RFA. This is another RFA funding mechanism. I apologize for the acronyms. RFA is request for applications, and that's one of the primary routes by which we fund external research. Is we issue these RFAs and receive applications for funding that we evaluate, and I'll get into that process a little later. But we released one this year for improving clinical trial capacity and increasing the infrastructure for clinical trials. And we certainly work with our care services staff to understand what that program should look like. And as that program is implemented, they'll certainly be on the front lines of understanding what processes are working and spreading them across sites. We're also working on a trial matchmaker tool that's in development, which would hopefully improve opportunities for participation in clinical research. And then certainly we work with care services staff on educational efforts at the clinic level. With advocacy, research staff work with advocacy as we advocate for increased government funding of research. And that's hugely important because organizations like, in particular, the NIH, but also the Department of Defense, have budgets for research that are much larger than that of the ALS Association. And so everything we can do to tilt their funding towards ALS is really valuable for the ALS research ecosystem. And we can do that directly working with advocacy, really talking to members of Congress on the Hill, talking about the importance of NIH and DoD for funding basic research and applied research for ALS. We can also do it with our funding programs. And so we, again, launched a funding program this year that's designed at helping investigators and labs across the country generate the data that's necessary to apply to the NIH. The NIH offers really large grants in terms of dollar value and the years that money is delivered, but in the application process, they require a significant amount of data justifying the project that's proposed. And so we're helping investigators generate that data so that they can then more successfully apply for these NIH grants. And so the idea is to leverage our funding because our research budget is smaller than NIH's, but if we can put it in the right place, we can convince NIH to spend more money on ALS and just grow the ALS research ecosystem at large. I already mentioned genetic testing and counseling and the work that our advocacy team is doing around protections for people who employ genetic testing and making sure that those results aren't used to alter insurance premiums or anything like that. We certainly also work with advocacy around FDA efforts in general. The example on this slide is around advocacy for AMX 0035, but certainly, especially with the Act for ALS, recently signed into law and becoming something that is being affected by FDA and NIH. We work with our advocacy colleagues to sort of help nudge FDA in what we think are the most appropriate directions for employing that new budget that they have available. So that's our work with the other two arms. And so then now to go into maybe a little bit more detail on what we aim to do with our research program. We've got a couple of topics listed here, and I want to give it a couple examples of those to make them mean something a little bit more concrete. So with collaborating and partnering, we certainly do a lot of different things with that, but this year, one of the new things that we're doing is seeking out partnership grant opportunities. And what that means is that we have offered to co-fund projects with other nonprofit groups that are working either directly in ALS or on efforts that are biologically or structurally in some way related to ALS. And the idea there is that we can identify organizations that have a specific expertise that's relevant for ALS and relevant to our mission, and we can work with them to leverage that expertise in a co-funding relationship where we can offer funding and perhaps connections that enable them to reach and fund more research projects than they otherwise would have been able to. And again, sort of shift resources towards the ALS research landscape rather than other related pieces of it. For convening and connecting, again, we do a lot of this. We do just a lot of sort of networking in general across academic researchers and industry researchers, and we try to make connections where we can. And one of the ways that we do that really explicitly is with our roundtable program. And this is a program where we bring the community together twice a year in general to discuss a specific topic of interest to the ALS community. And so we had our most recent roundtable a couple of weeks ago, middle of October, to discuss ways that we can increase clinical trial capacity. So we had a lot of discussion with clinicians who conduct those studies, with clinical research coordinators who are really the boots on the ground that are running these studies, with pharma industry folks who are funding these studies and looking for ways to make them more efficient, and with regulators from FDA that are interested in making sure studies are conducted in a way that leads to sound conclusions that the FDA can use to make decisions. And so this type of event, I think, is really valuable for the community because it's hard to get all those different people in the room at the same time. And when you do, I think we have really productive conversations that lead us to specific efforts either within the ALS Association or through external partners and partnerships that are formed at those meetings. We also try and lead and advocate. I mentioned some of our work with the advocacy team, but we can try and lead and advocate scientifically as well. And so one example that if I have time, I'll get back to at the end of the presentation, is that we funded a technology called antisense oligonucleotides much earlier than most organizations did so. And the importance of that is that this technology is something that is very adaptable and is a new way of hitting a drug target and trying to create a new therapeutic. And this sort of basic technical research is something that not a lot of organizations would fund. The NIH rarely funds sort of modality work versus biology work. And so we were able to fund that early on. And I think that really led to a lot of companies being able to leverage that technology to more quickly create differentiated therapeutics for a variety of different targets, both within ALS and in other neurodegenerative spaces. The first antisense oligonucleotide therapeutic actually was approved for muscular dystrophy. I'm trying to remember what year that was. It was maybe 3-4 years ago now. But it's a technique that we were some of the earliest funders of, and I think that's had benefits across the research landscape. We leverage and de-risk, and so here I like to talk about our Barnett drug development program because drug development is just hugely expensive. And if we tried to fund the entirety of a drug development process, we would just run aground halfway through. We just don't have the kind of money that's necessary for that. And so just like I talked about trying to leverage NIH and DoD a couple of slides ago, we try to direct our investments in research to places where other funders that have more money will pick up those funding projects and take them down the road through the sort of more expensive steps of drug development. And we did an analysis a while ago of our Barnett program, which focuses on preclinical drug development. So these are the steps right before a drug is first tested in humans. And the money that we put into those Barnett programs led to about 6x as much money coming into those projects to fund the later stages of development for that work. And so that's the type of leverage we're hoping to generate, is that we can fund early steps and make it more likely that other funders will fund the later steps that are absolutely necessary over time. And then finally, we fund and invest, and that really can cover most of the examples that I've talked about already. But the other type of investment that we make is in infrastructure and sort of efforts that will help the entirety of the research ecosystem at once. And that would include things like our fellowship funding for early career researchers, and we have a different fellowship program for early career clinical researchers. And the idea there is that if we fund at the right stage, we make it more likely that these talented young individuals that we identify are going to stay in ALS research and ALS clinical research and really be the foundation of the workforce that we need to continue to advance our mission over time. So let's see, I guess those were General principles, I mentioned a couple of these awards already. I won't go into too much detail right now, but I did want to just highlight that these are the specific funding programs that we ran in 2022. And these are the RFAs that I mentioned, the request for application. It's the primary way that we fund external research, is that we identify a specific topic where we think research investment would make a difference. And we request applications from those who can do research projects within that topic area. And some of these RFAs are things that we run every year, like Eric Safenowitz Postdoctoral Fellowship and the Barnett Drug Development Awards. We've been running these for several years now. We have a strong history here and really a portfolio of projects and people that we've invested in over time. And then some of them are new, and maybe we'll continue to run them every year, or maybe they're more intermittent, and it's something where we see a specific gap or a specific opportunity to fund a particular type of research. So I talked about, I think I actually mentioned most of these, including seed awards and prevention and our trial capacity awards in our partnership program. And so these are opportunities to fund specific types of research in a specific structure. And most of these end up being 2 to 3 to 4 year grants. And they range from the seed awards, which are around $50,000 per award, to the clinical trial awards, which support early stage clinical trials. And those are up to $1 million over 3 years. So I have an appendix at the end of this presentation. If there are questions on any of these specific programs, I'm happy to get into the details of what we're hoping to achieve with any one of them. But in the interest of time, I'll skip through that for now. And instead, I wanted to talk a little bit about the process by which we select applications for funding. So we issue these RFAs, requests for applications, but then how do we select the right ones to fund? And what do we do with them once we've decided which ones to fund? So I apologize that this is a little bit inside baseball, but we do get a lot of questions about this. And I certainly think it's very important to make sure that the process is logical and fair and is really attentive to the needs of really everyone involved in the research ecosystem. And so we need to make sure that the goals of our RFAs are in line with their mission. We need to make sure that the science is the best science that we can identify. And we need to make sure that the process is something that inspires confidence, both across across our community that we represent, the ALS patient community, but also across the research community of folks who are interested in working in ALS. We need to make sure that their confidence is high in us as well. So the process in brief is that we start with a letter of intent, which is quite short. And the idea here is that this is from applicants that think they have an idea that would be a fit. And we review that quickly to tell them, well, yes, this is a good idea. This does fit with the topic. This does fit with the type of work that we want to fund. Please do submit a full proposal. Or no, thank you for the idea. This is not what we're looking for at this time. We'll save you and us time and effort. We don't need to see a full proposal from you. And then the full proposals come in, and those are much more in-depth documents with a lot more scientific detail. And we have those peer reviewed by an independent panel of external experts. Again, it helps to be to have a lot of history with the ALS research ecosystem, because we know a lot of these experts and we can call them in to help us with their review. And so we really do rely on these experts to help us out. And we have a great group of reviewers that we're able to access. And here, in addition to verifying sort of alignment with our mission and with the goals of the RFA, these experts are evaluating whether or not this project is likely to succeed and whether or not the team has the appropriate resources to do this, and the value of it, really the impact that we could expect to see, the timeline we could expect to see that impact from the proposed project. And so that group, our research committee or external experts, gives us sort of a ranked list of projects. And then ultimately we take that list to our research committee, which is a subcommittee of the board of trustees, and it's the board of trustees. And it's a group of volunteers that are comprised of people living with ALS, caregivers, scientists, clinicians, business professionals. And ultimately that committee is the one that provides final approval for funding and how much for funding specific projects and how much we can fund them for. And once we have the approval of that committee, and once we have contracts in place, we fund these programs in a milestone-based manner such that we make sure that they are continuing to progress towards the goals that they have laid out before we give them the additional funding. And of course, we do try to help them along the way as we can. Again, perhaps that's by making connections. Perhaps that's by just knowing about different resources in the ALS research ecosystem that we can connect them with and hope to help them achieve their goals more quickly. And we do have requirements around collaboration, data sharing, specimen sharing, and publication of results and things like that. So that's the process. And again, I guess we're going to hold questions till the end, but if there are questions on that, happy to come back to this slide and discuss. Next, I wanted to give a brief overview. I've already used the term the ALS research ecosystem quite a few times, but this is what I mean by that. I've divided it somewhat arbitrarily into drug development and managing ALS. And what I want to emphasize with this slide is that both of these pieces are really important for achieving our mission. We tend to think a lot about new drugs and new treatments, and that's obviously super important. And we spend a lot of time and effort and money on that effort, on efforts that are related to drug development and to disease biology and things like that. But in terms of making ALS a livable disease, we really do need to focus on managing ALS as it is now as well. And so that could be efforts around assistive technology. That's something that obviously research can fund, but it can also be things that are not traditionally thought of as part of the research portfolio, but are part of our research portfolio, which can include research into things like family and caregiver burden, and to understanding the quality of life of people living with ALS and using that data to push funders like Medicare towards funding specific either pieces of technology or lifestyle interventions or whatever it may be that can help people living with ALS today. So both of these pieces are important parts of the ALS research ecosystem for us. I did want to take just a second to talk about drug development and why you commonly see this sort of funnel shape for drug development. And that's because at the left end of the funnel, where I don't think I have a pointer, maybe I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, so I'll stop using it. But at the left edge of this funnel here, it's much broader because there are a lot more projects, largely in academic labs, that are focused on maybe the biology and genetics of ALS, and sort of understanding basic biology. And those projects are sort of smaller and cheaper than things like preclinical drug development or even biomarker development, where you're moving away from basic academic research and starting to move towards clinical research, which is often funded through industry, pharma, and biotech groups. And so those efforts, there are fewer of them, but they're more expensive. And similarly, phase 1 trials tend to be more expensive or are significantly more expensive than preclinical drug development. And there are fewer of them. And likewise with phase 2 and phase 3. And that's important for us because it does dictate some of what we are able to do. So we are able to fund entire projects at the biology and genetics of ALS level. And so we can fund, for example, our Safinowitz postdoctoral fellowships, and we can expect to see a project really go from start to completion with essentially only our funding behind it. That's less true at the preclinical drug development stage. We often fund either labs that are working with biotechs or small biotechs that are starting out, and they have some of their own funding to fund some of that work. And we fund some of the other crucial steps of preclinical drug development. And so working together, then we ultimately end up with a data package that supports moving to a phase 1 trial. And at that point, we don't generally have enough money to support an entire phase 1 trial, but again, we can support pieces of it. We can be a crucial funder. We can support a large fraction of that and really enable a phase 1 trial to be completed. Then you get to the level of a phase 2 and a phase 3 trial, and these are tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, and we can't support that big of a fraction of those. What we can do instead is support small pieces. Maybe that is a biomarker project that is working with a phase 2 trial, or maybe it's an infrastructure effort, like I mentioned our clinical trial capacity grants, to make all these clinical trials easier, faster, more efficient, more accessible for everyone that's involved in the clinical trial, including people living with ALS who have the opportunity for more participation and also for sponsors of trials who have the potential for sort of faster, better, quicker, cheaper clinical trials. So the idea of getting to an answer sooner through funding infrastructure rather than specific development projects is sort of what we do towards the later stages of drug development. Let's see. Actually, I think I was supposed to do this animation first, but we do fund across this entire ecosystem. That's what that circle is supposed to represent. And I should mention that we do have about 120 active projects now, with about 44 million committed to those projects across 11 countries. So I think I said 12 earlier, so it's 11 countries currently. That, I think, concludes my sort of overview of our process. And like I said, I'm happy to go back to talk more about our specific RFAs and some of the specific efforts that are underway, as of 2022 in our research department. But before doing that, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about a couple of pieces of drug development news. And I just chose these because they have been in the headlines recently, and they're often topics of interest that we're asked about. So I wanted to just give a quick overview of some of these topics, though again, happy to go into more detail in the questions later. So first, AMX0035. This is Amylyx's drug development program, or I'm still used to referring to it as AMX0035 because that's how it was referred to while it was a research candidate, as a drug candidate that was in research. And it has recently been approved by the FDA as Relyvrio, and so I will get used to saying Relyvrio hopefully very soon. But this product is also known as PB-Terso. You may have heard that name as well. It's a project where we supported some of the early development efforts, a little more than $2 million, starting several years ago, both directly to the early research into this combination therapy and into infrastructure that supported the clinical trials of AMX0035, of Relyvrio. And it's been a long process. The phase 2 results were published in November of 2020, so 2 years ago. The original NDA, the new drug application, was filed with the FDA about a year ago. And since then, there have been 2 FDA advisory committee meetings to discuss this approval process. And these advisory committees are what happens often when the FDA feels it has a tough decision in front of it. It likes to call in external experts and get them to comment on the drug development application that is before them. And in general, it's really surprising that there were 2 meetings, and the 2 meetings were quite a bit different in terms of sort of tone and the exact data discussed, and ultimately the end result of the voting. But in both meetings, Amylyx presented data on function as represented by the ALS FRSR, the ALS Functional Rating Scale, revised, and in terms of survival for people with ALS who are taking AMX0035. And in both, the FDA raised and wanted to discuss concerns about whether the effects that were seen in the clinical trial were real or whether they were due to chance, and also whether or not it made sense to wait for data from a second trial, because there is a large phase 3 trial of AMX0035 that's taking place, some in the US, with some sites in the US and some people living with ALS in the US, but largely in Europe. And that trial is suggested that it will be completed in like early 2024. And so there was some question of whether or not it made sense to wait for those results before having FDA make a decision. And it was interesting because these votes at the end of the advisory committee meeting are not binding on the FDA, but the FDA often follows these recommendations. And so at the first meeting, the committee voted 6-4 against approval of AMX0035. But then Amylyx submitted new data. FDA wanted to evaluate that new data. That new data was discussed in the second meeting that was in early September. And at that meeting, the panelists voted 7-2 in favor of approval. So that was, a big swing in emotions for all of us, thinking about one committee to the next, 6 months apart or 3 months apart. I'm not sure I've got those dates right, but in any case, a couple of months apart. And then, of course, leading to the approval at the end of September. I mentioned the ongoing phase 3 trial, and so that will certainly be interesting data, and we hope positive data, of course. And then the rollout in the US is ongoing. Amylyx is hoping that the drug will be available around Thanksgiving, but we really don't have a lot of direct information on that. I'm not sure they do either. And then we're working to ensure that the drug itself is available, accessible, and affordable. And that's largely through our advocacy arm rather than research at this point. But that accessibility is a very important part of drug development and of new treatments and cures. And so we want to make sure that we're aware of that. And then I will say, as an aside, that does govern some of our funding decisions on the research side. And so an example is that this is a new therapy, and that's great. It's specifically for ALS, and I think we do have really positive data. And so I'm really glad that this is rolling out to people living with ALS. But we're also interested in repurposing older therapies, because that's a way that we can potentially get more affordable medicines to people with ALS, as long as we can show that they do have a reasonable benefit. And so we do fund a lot of that type of research through a couple of different mechanisms. And ultimately, we hope that that will have an impact on accessibility and affordability, in addition to sort of just being high quality science, which we always try to fund. Next, after Amylyx, I wanted to talk briefly about tofersen, which is another drug development candidate, late stages of development now, that's been getting some headlines recently. This drug candidate itself is an antisense oligonucleotide, an ASO. And I mentioned previously that ASOs are a new type of drug that we invested in early on. And so I think this is one of the fruits of that investment, is this specific drug. Though we did not invest on this specific program, we did invest on the technology many years ago. This specific program and drug candidate tofersen is for people who have mutations in the SOD1 gene. And so this therapy would only be effective for that subset of people with ALS. But that said, I think the potential of genetic medicines to be very specifically targeted is something that's really exciting about ASOs in general, and about this development program in particular. So the process for this drug is that in October of 21, they announced the initial results of the phase 3 trial, and they missed the primary endpoint. It did not look great at that point. They didn't see a lot of change in function, but this was a 6-month trial, and they continued to gather data through an open label extension to that trial. And so then in June of this year, they looked at that longer term follow-up data, and they found promising signs in some of the secondary endpoints and biomarker measures. And so they decided that that evidence was strong enough to submit to the FDA, and they did that in July of 2022. And initially, FDA had hoped to get a decision back to them in January, which of course January of 2023, which of course we were all excited about, though recently FDA has decided that they need a little bit more time to evaluate the data. And so right now, we're all expecting a decision from FDA by the end of April of 2023. And we do know that FDA will again hold an advisory committee meeting before making their decision, though the date for that has not yet been announced. So that's another exciting program. Last headline topic, I see we're getting a little low on time here, so I will move relatively quickly, but is the Healey platform trial. And this is something that, again, I think gets a lot of attention in the ALS research ecosystem. And I think for good reason. I think it's a really interesting structure. It's a platform trial, which is really about testing multiple drugs at the same time. And there are a lot of advantages to this. It reduces the cost of the trial. It increases the speed of the trial. It reduces the number of participants who are on placebo as opposed to one of the active drugs. And it's really, I think, a success story. This is the first platform trial in ALS. It's a relatively uncommon structure. It's more common in cancer and a couple other diseases. And so we're certainly taking advantage of the advances there. But we and others invested a couple of years ago in getting this infrastructure set up for ALS. And I think it's been really valuable in terms of paving the way to a clinical trial for a lot of groups that would have had more difficulty doing it without this structure in place. And so I guess what I wanted to say about these specific treatments that are, or drug candidates, excuse me, that are on trial in the Healey platform trial. The first two arms up here, zicluplan and verdiperstat, announced their results relatively recently, within the last couple of months. And unfortunately, they did not see any beneficial effects in those trials. And so that sounds like bad news, and it certainly is for those development programs. But I think there is value in the fact that these trials led to a strong conclusion, and they did so quickly. And so we don't need to devote more resources to those specific development programs, and we use those resources for other development programs. CNM-AU8, which is from Clean Nanomedicine, also recently announced their results, and there the results were a bit more mixed. They missed their primary endpoint, which was the ALS-FRSR, the functional rating scale that is a measure of disease progression. I'm sure you're all familiar with. But they did see some promising signs in a subgroup analysis that looked at survival. And so this type of result, a subgroup analysis, is something that generally needs verification in another larger trial. And so I think that's the decision that's in front of Clean right now, is deciding whether or not the results they see are strong enough to justify that trial or not. And so we'll certainly be anticipating that decision. And then next, predopidine from Prolinia Therapeutics is expected to read out relatively soon. So we're hoping to see results of that in the next couple of months, maybe even weeks. I don't have an exact timescale for that one, but certainly looking forward to that as well. And then the other thing to mention is just that this is a relatively current diagram. I'm sorry, the image quality is not great on it, but it is reflecting the drugs that are currently in the Healey platform trial, but efforts continue to add other drug candidates to the trial. And there are at least two of them that are in contracting now and should be added soon. So I think this is, really promising effort for ALS drug development, and something that we're glad to have helped fund the initiation of. So there, okay, so that gets me to my last slide there.